The morning of December 15th started like any other winter day in Detroit, except it was much colder than usual. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, and a thin layer of fresh snow covered the ground. It was the kind of cold that made everyone hurry to get inside, but one young boy had no choice but to be out in the bitter weather. Marcus Thompson, a skinny 12-year-old with bright eyes and a worn-out backpack, walked slowly down Jefferson Avenue at 7:30 in the morning. His old sneakers, which he had gotten from a donation box 6 months ago, were falling apart. The right shoe had a large hole near the toe, and the left one's sole was coming loose, making a flapping sound with each step he took. Every few steps, Marcus would stop and wiggle his toes, trying to get some feeling back into them. The thin socks he wore were soaked from the snow, and his feet felt like blocks of ice. Still, he kept walking. He had to get to school because today was an important math test, and Marcus never missed school if he could help it. His mother, Sarah Thompson, worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. She left for her first job at the diner at 5 a.m. and wouldn't be back until after her evening shift at the grocery store. Marcus knew she felt bad about not being able to buy him new shoes, but he never complained. He saw how hard she worked and how tired she was every day. As Marcus passed by the local coffee shop, he could see people inside wearing warm coats and holding hot drinks. The steam from their cups made little clouds in the air, and Marcus imagined how nice it would feel to wrap his cold hands around a warm cup. But he kept walking, pulling his thin jacket tighter around himself. Officer James Bennett was driving his usual morning patrol route in his police car. He had been on the force for 15 years and knew every street and alley in this part of town. As he turned onto Jefferson Avenue, something caught his eye. Through the light morning snow, he spotted a small figure walking alone. The officer slowed his car down, watching as the boy took careful steps on the icy sidewalk. What caught his attention wasn't just that a young kid was walking alone in the cold. It was the way the boy was walking. Every few steps, the child would stop and shift from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable. Bennett pulled his car closer to the curb and noticed the boy's shoes. His heart sank as he saw the holes and the way the shoes were practically falling apart. The sight reminded him of something from his own past, a memory he had carried with him for over 20 years. The police officer watched as Marcus tried to jump over a small pile of snow, but his loose shoe made him stumble. The boy caught himself before falling, but Bennett could see him shivering from the cold. Without hesitation, he turned on his car's lights. Not the emergency lights, just the regular ones. Marcus heard the sound of a car slowing down behind him and turned around. When he saw the police car, his heart started beating faster. He hadn't done anything wrong, but seeing police always made him nervous. His friend Michael had told him stories about police stopping kids for no reason. Officer Bennett parked his car and stepped out. He was a tall man with broad shoulders, but his face was kind. He had laugh lines around his eyes, and despite the cold, he wore a gentle smile. The name tag on his uniform caught the morning light. Officer J. Bennett. Marcus stood still, his feet now completely numb from standing in the snow. He watched as the officer walked toward him, snow crunching under his heavy boots. The boy's mind raced with questions. Was he in trouble? Had something happened to his mom? Should he run? But there was something different about the way this officer looked at him. It wasn't suspicious or stern. It was concerned. Officer Bennett stopped a few feet away from Marcus, his breath making clouds in the cold morning air. He looked down at the boy's shoes, then back at Marcus's face, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Neither Marcus nor Officer Bennett knew it yet, but this cold winter morning was about to become the beginning of an extraordinary story that would touch not just their lives, but the lives of thousands of others in their community. The cold winter wind blew harder as Officer Bennett took another step toward Marcus. The boy's heart was beating so fast he could hear it in his ears. His first thought was to run, but his frozen feet wouldn't move. The only sound between them was the soft crunch of snow under the officer's boots. "Those shoes," Officer Bennett said, pointing at Marcus's feet. "Take them off." Marcus blinked in confusion. Did he hear that right? The officer wanted him to take off his shoes. Here, in the snow. Even though his shoes were old and broken, they were the only ones he had. His mind raced with questions, but his mouth couldn't form words. "Sir," Marcus managed to say, his voice shaking partly from cold and partly from fear. I don't understand." Officer Bennett's face remained serious. Your shoes, Stun? I need you to remove them right now. His voice was firm but not angry. He took another step closer, and Marcus took a small step back, almost slipping on the icy sidewalk. A few early morning workers walked past them, giving curious looks at the scene. A police officer asking a young boy to remove his shoes in the freezing cold. Some slowed down their pace, watching to see what would happen next. Marcus's hands trembled as he reached down to untie his shoelaces. The right one was so frayed it came undone easily, but the left one was frozen stiff. As he struggled with the laces, tears started forming in his eyes. He tried hard not to let them fall, not wanting to cry in front of the officer or the people watching. Please, Marcus whispered, these are my only shoes. I need to get to school. He thought about his math test, about how his mother always told him education was the most important thing. How was he supposed to go to school with no shoes? Officer Bennett watched the boy struggle with his shoelaces. His face softened a bit, but he didn't back down from his request. Trust me for just 1 minute, he said, his voice gentler now. Sometimes things aren't what they seem. Finally, Marcus got both shoes off. He stood there in his wet socks on the snow-covered sidewalk, his feet burning with cold. He held out his tattered sneakers to the officer, trying his best to stand tall even though he felt scared and confused. But instead of taking the old shoes, Officer Bennett turned and walked back to his police car. Marcus stood frozen in place, not sure what to do. Should he run? But where would he go with no shoes? And why was the officer going to his car? The small crowd of onlookers had grown larger. Some had their phones out, thinking they were witnessing something bad happening. One woman stepped forward, about to say something to the officer, when suddenly everyone went quiet. Officer Bennett opened his patrol car's trunk and pulled out a large shopping bag. The rustling of the plastic bag seemed very loud in the quiet morning air. He walked back to Marcus, who was now shivering badly from standing in his wet socks on the snow. Marcus stared at the shopping bag, confused. He couldn't understand what was happening. First, the officer made him take off his only shoes, and now he was bringing him a bag. His cold toes curled against the wet pavement as he waited. The officer knelt down in front of Marcus, setting the shopping bag on the dry part of the sidewalk. He looked up at the boy with kind eyes, very different from his serious expression just moments ago. The morning sun reflected off his badge as he reached into the bag. Sometimes, Officer Bennett said softly, we have to let go of something old to receive something new. Marcus watched, his mouth slightly open in surprise, as the officer pulled something out of the bag. The crowd of people around them leaned in closer, phones still recording, but now their faces showed curiosity instead of concern. What happened next would not only change Marcus in mourning, but would start a chain of events that would touch the hearts of everyone in their community. The confrontation that had started with fear was about to turn into something completely unexpected. From inside the shopping bag, Officer Bennett pulled out a brand new pair of winter boots. They were dark blue with thick black soles, waterproof, and lined with warm material inside. Marcus's eyes grew wide as he stared at them. These weren't just any boots. They were exactly like the ones he had seen in the mall window last week, the ones he knew his mother could never afford. These, Officer Bennett said, holding up the boots, are size 7, right? He looked at Marcus's old shoes on the ground and then back at the boy's surprised face. I noticed you've been wearing size 6, but they're too small for you. That's why your toes were curling up when you walked. Marcus couldn't speak. He just nodded, still not sure if this was really happening. The people watching from the sidewalk had stopped recording with their phones. Now they were just smiling, some wiping tears from their eyes as they watched the scene unfold. Sit down here, Officer Bennett said, patting a dry spot on the bench nearby. He pulled out a pair of thick wool socks from the shopping bag too. Your current socks are soaked. That's dangerous in this weather. You could get really sick. With shaking hands, Marcus sat down and let the officer help him put on the new socks. They were the warmest things he had ever felt on his feet. As Officer Bennett helped him try on the first boot, Marcus finally found his voice. Why? He asked quietly. Why are you doing this? Officer Bennett paused, holding the second boot. His eyes seemed far away for a moment, like he was remembering something from long ago. The morning traffic passed by, but in that moment, it felt like time had slowed down just for this story to be told. 20 years ago, the officer began, I was just like you, walking to school in shoes that didn't fit, holes in my socks, too proud to ask for help. He helped Marcus put on the second boot as he continued talking. One day, a stranger saw me, really saw me, and they helped me, just like I'm helping you now. Marcus stood up in his new boots. They fit perfectly. His feet were already getting warmer, and for the first time that morning, he couldn't feel the cold biting at his toes. He took a few steps, testing them out. It felt like walking on clouds. That stranger, Officer Bennett continued, was a police officer too. And that day changed my life. It's why I became a police officer myself. He picked up Marcus's old shoes from the ground. Sometimes, a small act of kindness can change everything. A woman from the crowd stepped forward. She worked at the coffee shop across the street and was holding 2 paper cups. Here, she said, handing them each a cup of hot chocolate. It's on the house. Her eyes were wet with tears, but she was smiling. Marcus wrapped his cold hands around the warm cup, just like he had imagined doing earlier when he passed by the coffee shop window. The hot chocolate warmed him from the inside out, but it wasn't just the drink that made him feel warm. It was something else, something bigger. "Thank you," Marcus said, looking up at Officer Bennett. His voice was stronger now, more confident. "I'll never forget this." "Just promise me one thing," Officer Bennett said, sipping up the now empty shopping bag. "Someday, when you see someone else in need, remember this moment. Remember that sometimes the smallest actions can make the biggest difference." The crowd around them had grown even larger, but Marcus barely noticed them now. He was too busy looking at his new boots, still amazed at how this morning had turned out so differently than he expected. His feet were warm, his heart was full, and his mind was already thinking about ways he could help others, just like Officer Bennett had helped him. What started as a scary confrontation had turned into something beautiful. The revelation wasn't just about new boots or warm socks. It was about how one person's kindness could change another person's whole world. And this was just the beginning of an even bigger change that was about to sweep through their community. As Marcus and Officer Bennett sat on the bench drinking their hot chocolate, time seemed to slow down. The morning rush of people had thinned out, and the snow was falling softly around them. Neither of them was in a hurry anymore. This moment felt too important to rush. "What's your name, son?" Officer Bennett asked, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Marcus Thompson, sir," Marcus replied, feeling much more comfortable now. "I live with my mom on Pine Street. She works 2 jobs. He paused, then added proudly, "She never misses a day of work, even when she's tired." Officer Bennett smiled, writing something in his notebook. "Your mom sounds like a strong woman. My mother was the same way." He closed the notebook and looked at Marcus. "Would you like to hear a story about when I was your age?" Marcus nodded eagerly, taking another sip of his hot chocolate. The officer's face became thoughtful as he began to share his past. "When I was 12, just like you, my family struggled too," Officer Bennett began. "My shoes had holes, my coat was too small, and sometimes there wasn't enough food for dinner. But I was too embarrassed to tell anyone at school." Marcus leaned forward, surprised to hear that this strong, confident police officer had once been just like him. The steam from his hot chocolate made little clouds in the cold air as he listened. "One winter morning," Officer Bennett continued, "I was walking to school in the snow. My feet were freezing because my shoes were full of holes. That's when Officer Rodriguez found me. He was an old police officer who patrolled our neighborhood." "What did he do?" Marcus asked, completely absorbed in the story. "He did exactly what I just did for you." Officer Bennett smiled. "He bought me new boots. But he did something even more important. He became my friend. He checked on me every week, helped me with homework, and showed me that police officers aren't just about enforcing laws. They're about helping people." A small group of students walked past them, heading to school. Marcus suddenly remembered his math test, but Officer Bennett was already ahead of him. "Don't worry about being late," he said, pulling out his phone. "I'll call your school and explain everything. What's your teacher's name?" After Officer Bennett made the call, he turned back to Marcus. "Your teacher, Ms. Rodriguez. Any relation to the Officer Rodriguez I mentioned?" Marcus shook his head, but then Officer Bennett's eyes lit up. "Wait a minute. She's his daughter. She became a teacher because she saw how her father helped kids in the community. This is amazing." Both of them sat there, amazed at how life had connected all these pieces together. Ms. Rodriguez was always kind to Marcus, and now he understood why. Life is funny that way, Officer Bennett said. Sometimes things come full circle. Officer Rodriguez helped me, and now his daughter is your teacher, and I'm helping you. It's like a chain of kindness that keeps going. Marcus looked down at his new boots, then back at the officer. So what happened to Officer Rodriguez? He retired years ago, but he still volunteers at the community center. In fact, Officer Bennett paused, checking his watch. He's probably there right now, helping serve breakfast to kids before school. A new idea sparked in Marcus's eyes. Could we go meet him? Officer Bennett stood up, brushing snow from his uniform. Tell you what, how about after your math test today, I pick you up from school? We can go to the community center together. I know Officer Rodriguez would love to meet you. Marcus jumped up, excited about the plan. His new boots made a satisfying crunch in the fresh snow. Really? You do that? Of course, Officer Bennett said, walking Marcus to his patrol car. But first, let's get you to school. You got a math test to ace. As they drove to school, Marcus realized something had changed inside him. This wasn't just about new boots anymore. It was about connection, about understanding that everyone has a story, and about how helping others can change lives in unexpected ways. Little did either of them know, but this connection they formed on a cold winter morning was just the beginning. Their story was about to touch many more lives in ways they couldn't imagine. That afternoon, while Marcus was taking his math test, something unexpected was happening in the city. The people who had witnessed the morning's events couldn't stop talking about what they had seen. The story of the police officer and the boy with worn-out shoes began spreading like wildfire through Detroit. Mrs. Chen, the owner of the coffee shop who had given them hot chocolate, had taken a few photos that morning. She posted them on her social media with the caption, "Real heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear police badges and give boots to children in need. Witness this beautiful moment this morning outside my shop." Within hours, her post had been shared thousands of times. Local news stations started calling her shop, wanting to know more about what had happened. People from all over the city were commenting and sharing their own stories of struggling children they had seen in their neighborhoods. Sarah Thompson, Marcus's mother, was taking orders at the diner when her phone started buzzing with messages. Her coworker, Linda, rushed over with her phone, showing her the viral photos. There was her Marcus, sitting on a bench with a police officer, trying on new boots. "Sarah, your boy is all over social media," Linda exclaimed, wiping tears from her eyes. "That officer, what an amazing thing he did." Sarah had to sit down for a moment, overwhelmed with emotion. She had been saving money for new shoes for Marcus, putting aside a few dollars from each paycheck, but it was never enough. Now, seeing how someone had helped her son brought tears to her eyes. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Bennett's colleagues were gathering around computers and phones, watching the story spread. The police chief called Bennett into his office. "James," the chief said, looking at his computer screen, "do you realize what's happening? Your simple act of kindness has touched something in people's hearts. The phone hasn't stopped ringing with people wanting to help other kids like Marcus." Officer Bennett sat down, surprised by all the attention. "Sir, I was just doing what Officer Rodriguez did for me years ago. I didn't expect it to go viral." "Sometimes the smallest actions create the biggest waves," the chief replied. "We've already received dozens of calls from people wanting to donate winter boots and clothes for other children in need." Across town, at Marcus's school, students were whispering and pointing at their phones during lunch break. Ms. Rodriguez, now known to be Officer Rodriguez's daughter, had seen the posts too. She stood in front of her class after the math test, addressing her students with pride. "What happened this morning," she said, looking at Marcus with a warm smile, "is a perfect example of how one person's kindness can inspire others. My father helped Officer Bennett years ago, and now Officer Bennett has helped Marcus. This is how positive change happens." By the end of the school day, local businesses had started calling the police station. A shoe store offered to donate 50 pairs of winter boots. A clothing shop promised winter coats. The local news station wanted to interview Officer Bennett and Marcus. Even the mayor called the police station, praising the department for showing such compassion. She suggested starting a citywide program to help children in need, inspired by what had happened that morning. Sarah got permission to leave work early and rushed to Marcus's school to pick him up. When she arrived, she found him surrounded by classmates, all wanting to hear his story. But what touched her heart most was seeing her son's bright smile and confident stance in his new boots. "Mom," Marcus called out when he saw her, "you won't believe what happened today, and Officer Bennett is coming to take us to meet Officer Rodriguez at the community center." As Sarah hugged her son, more parents gathered around, offering support and sharing their own stories. One mother admitted her daughter needed new shoes too, but she couldn't afford them. Another parent immediately offered to help. What had started as one officer helping one boy had turned into something much bigger. The ripple effect was spreading through the community, touching hearts and opening eyes to the needs around them. And this was just the beginning. The story that had started with a pair of worn-out shoes was about to transform not just Marcus's life, but the lives of countless others in their city. The real miracle wasn't just in the giving. It was in how that single act of kindness was inspiring others to do the same. 1 week after the viral story of Marcus and Officer Bennett, the community center on Pine Street was packed with people. The mayor stood at a small podium, surrounded by local business owners, police officers, and excited community members. Marcus, his mother Sarah, Officer Bennett, and retired Officer Rodriguez sat in the front row. Today, the mayor announced, "We're launching Warm Souls, Warm Hearts, a program that will help make sure no child in our city has to walk to school in worn-out shoes or without proper winter gear." She looked directly at Marcus and Officer Bennett, smiling. Sometimes it takes just one story to show us what needs to be done. The shoe store owner, Mr. Parker, stepped forward with his announcement. "My store will provide 100 pairs of winter boots every month to children in need." He paused, his voice becoming emotional. "I was once a child who couldn't afford good shoes. Now it's my turn to help others." More local business owners stood up, each promising to help. Mrs. Chen from the coffee shop offered to provide hot chocolate and breakfast to any child who came to her shop showing signs of need. The owner of the winter clothing store promised coats and gloves. Even the local taxi company offered free rides to children walking to school in bad weather. Marcus watched all this happening with wide eyes. He leaned over to Officer Bennett and whispered, "Did we really start all this?" Officer Bennett smiled. "You see, Marcus, this is what happens when people open their eyes to helping others. One small action can grow into something amazing." Sarah Thompson wiped tears from her eyes as she watched more people step forward to help. Her boss from the diner stood up and announced that they would start a weekly free dinner program for families in need. Her other boss from the grocery store promised to provide food packages to struggling families. Retired Officer Rodriguez, now in his 70s but still sharp as ever, stood up to speak. His voice was strong despite his age. 40 years ago, I helped a young boy who needed boots. That boy grew up to be Officer Bennett. Now he's helped Marcus, and look at what's happening. This is how we build a stronger community, one act of kindness at a time." The local news crews were filming everything. A reporter asked Marcus to say a few words. Though nervous at first, he stood at the podium, looking at all the faces in the crowd. "Last week," Marcus began, his voice shaking a little, "I was just a kid with holes in his shoes. Now I'm standing here watching everyone want to help other kids like me. It makes me want to help too." The crowd clapped, and Marcus continued with more confidence. "So I had an idea. What if kids who get help through this program could also learn how to help others? We could do small things, like helping elderly neighbors shovel snow or carrying groceries for people who need help." The mayor's eyes lit up. "That's a wonderful idea, Marcus. We could make it a part of the program. Kids helping kids." Officer Bennett stood up and walked to the podium, placing a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I'd like to announce that the police department will be starting a mentorship program. Any officer who helps a child through Warm Souls, Warm Hearts can also become their mentor if they choose." The community center erupted in applause. People were hugging, crying, and already signing up to volunteer. Tables were set up around the room where people could donate, volunteer, or ask for help. Sarah watched as Marcus walked around the room, talking to other kids who had come with their parents. He was showing them his boots, but more importantly, he was listening to their stories. She saw him taking notes in a small notebook, just like Officer Bennett did. "Your son is quite something," Officer Rodriguez said to Sarah. "He's not just accepting help, he's learning how to give it too." By the end of the meeting, Warm Souls, Warm Hearts had more support than anyone expected. The program would start the very next day, and the first delivery of boots and winter gear was already scheduled for the weekend. What had started with one pair of boots was growing into a movement that would change their city forever. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth: when people come together to help others, amazing things can happen. 3 months had passed since the launch of Warm Souls, Warm Hearts, and Marcus Thompson was no longer just the boy who received help. He had become a leader among his peers. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, he sat at a small desk in the community center, wearing a blue volunteer badge that read Youth Ambassador. "How can I help you?" Marcus asked a shy 7-year-old girl who stood before him with her mother. The girl's shoes were taped together at the sides, just like his had been months ago. Marcus noticed how she tried to hide her feet behind each other. "It's okay," he said softly, remembering how he had felt that cold morning. "I used to have shoes like that too, but we're going to fix that today." He pulled out his special notebook, the one Officer Bennett had given him, and started writing down her information. The transformation in Marcus wasn't just about helping others. His grades had improved dramatically, especially in math. Ms. Rodriguez noticed he sat straighter in class now, raised his hand more often, and even helped other students who struggled with their work. "Remember when you thought you couldn't do fractions?" Ms. Rodriguez asked one day after class. "Now look at you, teaching them to others." Sometimes all we need is a little confidence to show us what we're capable of. At home, Sarah noticed changes too. Marcus had organized his own mini food pantry in their apartment building's lobby. Neighbors could take what they needed and leave what they could. The idea had come to him after seeing how many families visited the community center's food bank. "Mom," Marcus said one evening while doing his homework, "is it okay if I give my old jacket to Tommy in apartment 4B? I noticed he's wearing one that's too small, and since Officer Bennett's daughter gave me a new one." Sarah hugged her son, amazed at how much he had grown. Not in height, though he had grown there too, but in his heart and mind. The scared boy who once hid his worn-out shoes was now actively looking for ways to help others. Officer Bennett visited Marcus regularly, not just as a mentor but as a friend. They had a special handshake now, one that made other kids at school jealous. But Marcus taught them the handshake too, showing that friendship didn't have to be exclusive. One cold Friday afternoon, Marcus was working at his desk in the community center when Officer Bennett rushed in with exciting news. "Marcus," he called out, waving a paper. "Remember that essay competition you entered? The one about community service?" Marcus nodded, his heart beating faster. He had written about how receiving help had taught him to help others, and how one pair of boots had changed not just his life, but his whole way of thinking. "You won," Officer Bennett announced proudly. "First place. They want you to speak at the city's Youth Leadership Conference next month." The whole community center erupted in cheers. Mrs. Chen, who was serving hot chocolate as usual, brought over special cookies she had baked. Even retired Officer Rodriguez, who was teaching a group of kids how to play chess, came over to congratulate Marcus. "But I'm nervous about speaking in front of so many people," Marcus admitted quietly to Officer Bennett. "Remember how nervous you were that first morning when I approached you?" Officer Bennett asked. "Sometimes being nervous means you're about to do something important." Later that evening, as Marcus helped clean up the community center, he found himself staring at the Warm Souls, Warm Hearts poster on the wall. The program had helped over 200 kids so far, but it wasn't just about shoes anymore. It had become about dignity, friendship, and learning how to turn gratitude into action. "Penny for your thoughts?" asked Officer Rodriguez, walking up beside him. "I was just thinking," Marcus replied, "about how different everything is now. It's like I'm not the same person I was before." Officer Rodriguez smiled. "That's what transformation looks like, son. It's not just about changing what's on the outside. It's about growing on the inside too." Marcus nodded, understanding. His transformation wasn't finished, it was just beginning. And somewhere in the city, another child would need help, and now Marcus would be ready to give it. The gymnasium of Detroit Central High School was packed with students, teachers, and community members. It was the day of the Youth Leadership Conference, and Marcus Thompson stood backstage, adjusting his new tie. Officer Bennett had taught him how to tie it just an hour ago. "Remember," Officer Bennett said, straightening Marcus's collar, "just speak from your heart. like we practiced. Tell them your story the same way you tell the kids at the community center. Marcus peeked through the curtain. He saw his mother sitting in the front row, wearing her best dress. She had taken the day off from both jobs to be here. Next to her sat Ms. Rodriguez, Officer Rodriguez, and Mrs. Chen from the coffee shop. Even Mr. Parker from the shoe store was there, beaming with pride. The mayor stepped up to the microphone. Our next speaker is someone very special. 6 months ago, he was a boy with worn-out shoes. Today, he's helped change the lives of hundreds of children in our city. Please welcome Marcus Thompson. The audience clapped as Marcus walked onto the stage. His new shoes, bought with his own money from helping at the community center, made confident sounds against the wooden floor. He took a deep breath and began to speak. 6 months ago, I was embarrassed to go to school because of my old shoes. Today, I'm standing here to tell you about something amazing that happened when one person decided to help another person. His voice grew stronger as he continued. Officer Bennett didn't just give me new boots that day. He showed me that when someone helps you, you can learn to help others too. Now, Warm Souls, Warm Hearts has helped 278 kids in our city. But it's not just about shoes anymore. Marcus pulled out his notebook, the same one he used at the community center. In this book, I have stories from 50 kids who got help from our program. But the best part is, 45 of those kids are now helping other people too. He shared stories of children who had received help and were now volunteering. Tommy from apartment 4B was now helping elderly neighbors with groceries. Maria, who got new winter boots last month, was tutoring younger kids in math. And Josh, who received a warm coat, was helping at the animal shelter. Officer Bennett and I visit schools now, Marcus continued. We talk to kids about how they can help in their neighborhoods. Last week, we started a new project called Kids Teaching Kids, where children who are good at something teach other children who want to learn. The audience listened intently as Marcus explained how the partnership between the police department and local schools was changing the way children saw police officers. Now, when we see a police car in our neighborhood, kids don't run away. They wave because they know these officers are their friends. Officer Bennett joined Marcus on stage as they demonstrated their famous handshake, making everyone laugh. Then they showed pictures of their weekly mentoring sessions where they helped other kids learn the importance of both receiving and giving help. But the best partnership, Marcus said, his voice full of emotion, is the one between people who want to help and people who are brave enough to accept that help. Because sometimes the hardest thing to do is admit you need help. Sarah Thompson wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her son speak with such confidence. Officer Rodriguez leaned over and whispered to her, "Your boy is teaching us all something important about community." After the speech, students rushed to sign up for the Kids Teaching Kids program. Teachers asked about bringing the program to their schools. Local business owners offered more support. Back at the community center that evening, Marcus sat with Officer Bennett, looking at all the new sign-up sheets. "You know what's funny?" Marcus said, organizing the papers. "That morning when you made me take off my old shoes, I thought it was the worst day of my life. But it turned out to be the best." Officer Bennett smiled. "That's how partnerships work, Marcus. Sometimes they start in the most unexpected ways." As they watched new families enter the community center, Marcus and Officer Bennett stood side by side, ready to help. They weren't just a police officer and a boy anymore. They were partners in something much bigger than themselves. And their partnership was just one of many that were forming across the city, proving that when people work together, amazing things can happen.